I always enjoy preaching at Alamo Heights because I bear a similar resemblance to David Magnitsky. In fact, some people have approached me as David, and I try to pretend like I'm him, but he's much smarter than I am. I've preached at Alamo Heights 3 times. This is my third time that I've preached at Alamo Heights. First time was during COVID, and I preached on Pentecost Sunday, and we always have a thing where we have these sterno cans, and we light them, and there's always flame. And as I preached, the camera angle, because it was COVID, the camera angle had the flame coming out of my head. And so I always like to say that was the sermon when my hair was on fire. The second time was last year, and it was on July 4th weekend, and you all know what happened on July 4th last year. And so I had to write a different sermon for that. So I'm hoping that some catastrophe doesn't happen this week. So let's keep our fingers crossed and in prayer. We like to think of God as a kind, loving, benevolent parent who usually gives us what we ask for and even loves us even though we don't pay attention to him. And then it all falls apart when we have this experience that I just read in Genesis, with Abraham encountering God and God turning the tables on Abraham. With these words, the game changes completely. Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and offer him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will show you. That's not a God that I can trust. I mean, this is a God who made a promise to Abraham that he would have descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and that this one child was all there was to show for that promise. Abraham lived his life for the moment when Isaac took his first breath, because this was proof that Abraham's reckless faithfulness over many years was finally paying off. Abraham had given up everything to hear and to follow and to be obedient to God. In his old age, now at 99 years, God finally miraculously provided a son. And now with these few words, it says, as if God changed the game completely. Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and offer him as a burnt offering. I can only imagine what that would feel like, but I think you know what that feels like. What do you do when you feel cornered or trapped in a dead-end job or a dead-end life? What do you do when you feel like your life should go one way, but then all of a sudden your life is going a different way? What do you do when you hate your job? When you're working, but there's no passion in what you do, but you feel that you need to keep the job, you need to keep working? What do you do when you're in a body that just won't do what you will it to do? You're trapped in a physical frame with no hope of cure. What do you do when you feel like there's no way out, that the only option there seems to be is to give up? Walter Cannon in 1932 coined the phrase, fight or flight syndrome. The best example that I ever heard is a farm example because I was raised on a farm. Say there's a chicken and you bum rush the chicken and the chicken just freezes. The chicken doesn't do anything. It just freezes there in place. The chicken clearly perceives a threat, but it doesn't move because it can't figure out whether to fight or flight. The chicken is frozen because it's trapped in indecision. And we're often the same. But frozen doesn't mean that other things aren't happening. In fight or flight syndrome, physical changes happen. Our pupils dilate so that we can see more clearly. Our hairs stand on end, making us more sensitive to our environment. Our heart rate goes up. The heart goes from pumping 1 gallon of blood a minute to 5 gallons a minute. And the arteries constrict to maximize pressure. In other words, our blood pressure goes up. Fat and glucose is metabolized to create instant energy. Endorphins are released, making you less sensitive to pain. The natural judgment system is turned off, and it goes from rational to instinctual. This is a time for action and not a time for deep thought. Now, this fight-flight syndrome is normally reserved for crisis situations. But when we feel trapped in our lives, that fight-flight response with the psychological and physiological responses, it happens over and over again. And the result is that our bodies suffer the consequences: high blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease, mental illness. When we feel cornered or trapped in our lives, our bodies respond even if we don't act, and that can harm us. So what do you do when you feel trapped in life? Let me give you a personal example that happened just a few weeks ago for me. When it seems like all the options go out the window and you just don't know what to do. On May 2nd, just 6 weeks ago, we got a phone call from our son and our daughter-in-law who have lived in Australia for 5 years. They told us about their struggle with their mini Australian Shepherd dog, Winnie. You see, Winnie is 14 years old and she has doggy dementia. I didn't know dogs could get dementia, but she's the living example of it. Our son had a major business meeting coming up, and his wife had to go with him. And they'd arranged for a dog sitter, but the dog sitter worked, so she could only take care of Winnie in the morning and in the evening. This was May 2nd that they called and just talked to us about this dilemma. On May 3rd, they called again and said that they were going to have to make some hard decisions about Winnie. And that was a hard conversation to have about a dog that they loved. And then they did it. They called the next day and they said, "Could you come and babysit our dog to Australia?" I don't know if any of you have been to Australia, but it's a 24-hour trip. It just travel time, 16 hours in one of the legs. It's a long trip. My wife, of course, said yes. And I grew up on a farm, and I have a whole different idea about animals. And initially I said, no, I'm not going to go. I'm not going to spend that kind of money on it. And my wife said, well, I'm going to go. And so we went. We left 2 days after that phone call. And for some reason, we got these ridiculously wonderful prices on airline tickets. I don't know how we did it. Booking last minute. It just happened. Everything went well. In fact, Winnie improved in health after we left. We were just trying to keep her alive, and she improved after we left. But here's the crowning moment. We drove to the airport, and as we were getting out of the car and getting our luggage out, my daughter-in-law gave me a big hug, and with tears in her eyes, she said, "Thank you." And Sally and I were dragging our luggage into the terminal, and I looked over at Sally and I said, "That's the best $10,000 I've ever spent." I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to go to Australia, but instead, I let go and I responded faithfully to my wife. And I waited to see what God would do, and God opened the doors. It seems as if Abraham responds to God almost immediately. He doesn't give up on God's promise, even though he's trapped into performing an action that puts the whole meaning of his life at risk. Without question, Abraham doesn't give up. Instead, he responds in faith. Abraham is positive that God will respond. For Abraham, the option is not to give up. The option is to go forward and to see what God would do, even in this extreme request. Immediately, Abraham stands and begins preparations for the trip to the mountain. It's odd that Abraham he'll argue with God about Sodom and Gomorrah. He'll even argue with God down to one righteous individual. But when it comes to God directing Abraham personally, Abraham doesn't say a word. He just responds. He always places God's will before his own, even when it involves surrendering what is most precious to him. Abraham is willing to give up his son, whom he loves, in order to maintain a relationship with God. For Abraham, his only option is to follow through in faith and then see what God will do. Abraham and Isaac make the journey to the mountain, which tradition calls Moriah or Zion, the holy mount of Jerusalem, a holy place to many religions. It's thought to be the place where the blood of the lambs poured out at Passover. It's reported that that's the place where Muhammad ascended into heaven. It's still a place today where God's presence is almost physically tangible. They prepare for the ascent. Abraham places the wood on Isaac's back, which means that Isaac is not an infant here. He's most likely a teenager. And he's likely a clueless teenager, which brings us to the point that Isaac is not the brightest bulb in the pack. After all, his name in Hebrew means laughter. And in some ways, Isaac is a very comical character in the biblical history. Abraham makes Isaac carry the wood, but Abraham carries the knife and the fire. Isn't that interesting? Abraham saves for himself the two things that could injure or hurt Isaac. There's love in his heart as Abraham ascends Mount Moriah with his son, his only son, Isaac, whom he loves. Abraham arranges the stones together to make a crude altar. He binds his clueless boy who says, well, Dad, we have the wood, we have the fire, but where's the sacrifice? Well, Isaac, here's the wood, here's the fire, you're tied up and you're laying on the wood. What do you think? Abraham was trapped. On the one hand, here is his son, his only son, whom he loved. Here was the fulfillment of God's promise, a promise for which Abraham had given up everything. If Abraham lifts the knife and sacrifices his son, if he draws the knife across his son's throat, then God's promise could be nothing but a lie. And if God's promise is a lie, then Abraham's life is nothing more than chasing after nothingness. Abraham chooses not to give up, but to go forward and to see what God will do. He strikes out in faith and obedience, and he's willing to go to the very edge to see what God will do. At the very moment that Abraham lifted the knife and committed himself to drawing it down, an angel stopped him. Abraham's obedience was rewarded with a ram caught by its horns in the brush. It reminds me of another faithful servant of God who once felt trapped. He had a very successful career, however brief it was. This particular time, it was night, it was after a meal, and all his friends had fallen asleep. They didn't have the foggiest idea what was about to happen, but he did. He kept vigil, prayed to God in the garden until he said, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done. Jesus didn't want to do what he knew was going to happen. Jesus was trapped in life. The only option was to give up or to give himself into God's hands and see what God could do. Well, we all know what Jesus did, and we all know what God did. That's why we're here. So when you feel trapped, don't give up. Just don't sit and do nothing, because something is going to happen no matter what. First, pray. Pray that God will give you direction and steady your feet and make a firm and straight path. Pray that God will direct your mind and your thoughts, and that God will be glorified in whatever you do. And then act. It may go against, take that first step forward. It may go against everything that you've been taught. It may go against every instinct that has been keeping you from doing it. Act in faith and see what God will do. Because like Abraham, like Jesus, who chose to be obedient to God even when the most horrifying requests were made, they saw God do marvelous things because they were obedient. Act. Take that first step forward and see what God will do. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Weekly Teaching. To watch the full live stream of this worship service, you can view all archived streams at the Alamo Heights UMC YouTube channel. If you have any questions, email us at podcasts@ahumc.org. That's podcasts@ahumc.org. You can also visit our website, ahumc.org, anytime. Any related links are also in this episode's show notes. Again, thank you so much for being a listener. We truly appreciate your time.